Hey gang, go ahead and check your Unit 6 notes for the page labeled The Gilded Age. And we're going to start working on that. It's just a front with a few things in the back, so it shouldn't be too long for us. So first of all, let's take a look at, what does the Gilded Age mean? The Gilded Age is a term that was coined phrased by Mark Twain. And the idea of a Gilded Age was the fact that things on the surface in the United States, industrialization and the growth of our country on the surface looks awesome. But if you really look underneath in the underside of it, poverty, wage slaves in the industrial sector, political corruption, there's a really ugly belly side to it. And so that's what the word gilded is. And you have to understand, it really revolves around industrialism. And industry existed prior to the Civil War, but for the most part, agriculture was the most significant part of our economy. And then post-Civil War, we became a very industrialized age. So we make this giant shift from agriculture to industry, not just on a personal level, but on a national level. And if you think about it, in the 1850s, most people worked for themselves. If you fast forward that 50 years in the 1900s, most people worked for a boss or were employed. And so that's kind of the shift that's going to take place, with obviously a little moment for the Civil War to take place, but that's the shift we're talking about right now. And you end up with this Gilded Age where on the surface it looks like it's gold and shiny. And then when you pick it up, you realize and look at it more closely and examine it that it's really not as maybe worth so much as you once thought. So the best way to think about gilded is when I was little, I used to get trophies, and from far away, sitting on the table at whatever competition, the trophies lined up, they were gold and sparkling, and then when I picked them up, I was like, this is plastic. So I gave you a prime example there. Brady, he was all excited about winning this medal. Closer surface, it's plastic. But it was nice that they won. So when does the Gilded Age take place? It's going to take place in the 1860s through 1900. And really, if we go in more specific terms, we're going to look at it through the end of Reconstruction, which is 1877, and it goes up until about 1893, which is the Panic of 1893, which is going to really slow down our growth there. And in those years, 1877 to 1893, our economy will double in size. And it's interesting to note that, for our first, say, 100 and so years of existence, the Europeans kind of were just like, oh, the Americans, there they are. It was kind of seen as like a playground. We weren't really considered an industrial power. But by 1914, we are going to have a much bigger, much broader industry than anybody in Europe. Okay, so this era kind of revolves around industrial growth. So some of the positives of the area. So number one is that you could live the American dream. You could become that next rags to riches story. That's why I have pictures of Rockefeller and Carnegie off to the right, because they were living that American dream. Both of them grew up in poverty. Andrew Carnegie was an Irish immigrant coming over. Rockefeller, we remember seeing from his struggles as a child and his father's kind of swindling ways, and the same with Edwin Drake, and that's the first oil refinery there in the background, is that there was an outside chance you could change your social status, where in Europe that, climbing the corporate ladder wasn't necessarily a thing yet. There were it was much easier to do that in the United States. New products, new inventions are going to feed a beginning of a consumer environment. In the 1920s, our consumerism is going to jump off the charts, and that's going to be fueled partly by the industry that's built during this age. And so that's certainly a positive. There are going to be a huge amount of labor-saving devices that are going to be created during this time and then available for mass consumption, so to speak, in the 1920s, and that process starts in the Gilded Age. New resources such as oil and steel are going to be the backbones of the American economy. We must have them. Those things are going to drive the American economy. The other thing that drives this is jobs. Jobs are going to be more available. So the fact that we have all these people rushing into urban areas and urbanization, we have immigrants coming in from outside this nation, we have the great migration of African Americans moving into cities, that there are going to be jobs available for those people. And the biggest thing is moving forward is that this industry that's built during the Gilded Age is going to be the same industry that's going to help us win World War II. And we will talk about this when we get into Unit 7 a little bit more and more complexity. But the reason that we're able to overwhelm the Japanese and overwhelm the Germans is eventually they can't keep up with our industrial production. We're able to mass produce planes and guns and tanks and armaments that they just were overrun with just our production. And so this industry is going to be born in this area. Some of the negatives that are going to be around is that there is going to be a lot of people who make really low wages, who work incredibly dangerous jobs. And there's going to be little to no support for workers. This is prior to the Knights of Labor, prior to the American Federation of Labor. We're going to get into that. They are going to come around, but at the beginning of this boom, there's nothing to help protect workers. Child labor will be born in this era because children will have to work to help their families survive. In one example we're going to talk about later on in the notes is Boss Cox, who had to work at the age of 8 to help keep his family afloat. There are going to be permanent cases of poverty throughout urban areas. Now, where we talked about in the positives that there was that outside chance that you could become that next great American dream story, 9 times out of 10, if you were born into poverty, you remained in poverty. Today, we call it kind of the cyclical effect of poverty, as sometimes families have the propensity to work themselves back into poverty and never can gain themselves out of that. There's going to be an enormous gap between the rich and the poor. If you think about the Carnegies and Rockefellers of the world and J.P. Morgans, those are going to become household names during the Gilded Age. People are going to think and dream of being those families, and those are people that are synonymous with American culture during the Gilded Age. And I would say it's a negative, this area, because Congress, courts, and the president were all very favorable to the business growth, which could be seen as a good thing because we get a lot of, oil and steel, and a lot of this American ingenuity was fostered by these governments. But on the other side of it, the crisis of child labor, the crisis of poverty, for the most part during the Gilded Age, the presidents will be very laissez-faire, very hands-off. And what will grow out of that will be corruption. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about next, is what were political machines and how do they work. So first of all, political machine is just basically a group of individuals. They usually have a boss, they usually have a leader, and they work to improve the things in the cities. Every city wanted better sewers, better bridges, better transportation, better schools. And because we have this industrial era that we're making so much wealth, those things seem attainable to people living in cities. And so what's going to happen is that democracies, these demands are going to be really, really hard to beat or hard to meet. One drawback of democracy will be that things work slowly. There are papers to be filled out and claims to be filed and processes to work through. And what happens in that is it takes a long time. And so sometimes it's seen as not very efficient. To bring about the order, kind of the chaos that was left over after the Civil War, city bosses or political machines will take over these big urban areas and help get those things accomplished and put those things into motion. And so it's an intricate web we have kind of developed, including graft, including political machines. And I have a drawing that I'm going to probably post on Google Classroom a little bit later on that kind of shows a way in which political machines and bosses work. But the best example is the best way is to probably give you a really good example of it in the form of Boss Tweed and Boss Cox, and we will get to those two individuals next. One thing that was very rampant throughout this time period was graft, and graft is illegal. It is basically the acquisition of money or power through illegal means or dishonest means. And if you look over to the right-hand side, I have some political cartoons that were popular today, showing how graft worked. And again, the best way to go through this is to give you a great example of this, and I will on the next slide. A lot of city projects, government offices built, streets, sewers installed, were always overbid. And let's say it costs $5,000 to get a job done. The city government would receive actually a bill for $10,000. So $5,000 will actually go to the company, and $5,000 will go to different people who need a government handout, and that could be the political boss, or it could be maybe the mayor or somebody else, and even the company may overbid it. So let's say it costs $5,000 to put in sewers, but the sewer company is owned by a good friend of the city boss, and the sewer company says we're going to charge $8,000, so we can have $3,000 of it. That's graft. Okay, that is graft. That's illegal today. So the most famous political machine is Boss Tweed. And Boss Tweed will rule the New York City Tweed Ring. They call it Tammany Hall a lot of times, for over 12 years. He kind of came to power at the end of the Civil War, 1864, and his reign will last all the way up into 1876. He's a very, very interesting fellow, very large, kind of gregarious fellow. And he will actually do a stint as a member of the House of Representatives. He will actually be a senator for a time being. But his most lucrative positions will be being appointed to boards on different New York City commission projects where he will be able to control the patronage. He will be able to basically control the purse strings of New York City and their construction projects and whatever projects they are undergoing. Boss Tweed really did he had this connection with the immigrants in New York City. And of course, we have like all these immigrants coming in New York City, getting jobs. A lot of times they would go to their precinct boss. Their precinct boss would then work with Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed would then get them a boss or get them a job. Then they would kind of owe their livelihood to the precinct boss and Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed would then make sure that they would be voting. So it's this kind of intricate cyclical thing of information where if you got your job through Boss Tweed or one of his cronies, then when it's time to go in to vote for mayor or go in to vote for whatever position's available, you're going to vote for who he wants to. And in return, let's say you would like your sidewalk repaved or reinstalled or whatever, then he's going to make sure on the backside of that those things are taken care of for you. And if he feels as though a precinct may not vote his way, there are lots of different opportunities that political bosses can use. They can use voter fraud, which basically means creating phony names for people. They can stuff the ballot. They can bribe people to vote. At one point in time, there were more votes for a particular individual in a New York City precinct than there were residents, so clearly something's not right there. They have on the records as somebody actually going in and voting as their dog. And then there's a 4-year-old who's on the poll who actually supposedly voted in one of the New York precincts for a candidate. So there's all these ways, illegal ways, to make sure that your people are elected and make sure your people pick the right construction company for any project, that construction company then overbids in the form of graft. And of course, those people will put to work those construction people who then will in turn vote for those same people in office who keep the process going. In this, Boss Tweed is estimated to have embezzled $25 to $45 million from New York taxpayers. And in the particular building you're looking at, that is actually called the Tweed Courthouse. And of course, it looks like it's a magnificent building. At the time it was built in the late 1870s, it should have cost around $300,000. And by the way, there are some additions that have been added on in the modern era, so that's not just the original building. But the original cost was $300,000. It actually cost taxpayers $13 million. So where did all that money go? That's a lot of money. That's 12 million. If I've done some math, 12 million, 12.7 million. Where did it all go? And they laugh about it because at the time, this $13 million building was actually, it cost more to build the Tweed Courthouse than it did to purchase Alaska. Actually, 2 times as much to build this courthouse than it was to purchase all of Alaska. Each window, $8,000. $350,000 were spent on carpets. That must have been some fabulous carpet. $41,000 was spent on brooms. So all this extra charge that the government's manning is clearly going back to pad the wallets of individuals who will then keep people voted in office to make sure these contracts run through. Even in the Tweed Courthouse, there was purposefully shoddy work done. Drywalling was not done correctly, plumbing was done incorrectly, so that way that these bad contractors would be hired back to make repairs and then cost more. So now you probably have an understanding of why that courthouse went from costing $300,000 to $13 million. Now, throughout this time, there's going to be a political cartoonist named Thomas Nast, N-A-S-T, and those political cartoons that I just posted in the last slide will come from him, and he will do his best to expose the political corruption of the Tweed Ring. What do we know that as? That's a muckraker, and we'll get into muckraking when we get into the progressives in the next era. But Thomas Nast had a knack for depicting what Boss Tweed looked like, and the important thing about the political cartoons were you didn't have to read to be able to see what was going on. And so a lot of this corruption was pretty much unveiled under the cloak of political cartoons. Eventually, Tweed would be prosecuted by a guy by the name of Samuel Tilden, who will run for president one day, and he will begin to serve prison time. As an interesting story on Boss Tweed, he was actually able to escape prison and was able to escape and found himself in Spain. And people in Spain actually recognized him based on the political cartoons by Thomas Nast that he was able to depict him so accurately. They caught him in Spain, eventually returned him to prison where he eventually died. Interesting how he got out of prison, though. Nobody really knows. It's a very hush-hush story. They believe that he still had quite a hold on the city's police division and prisons, and was able to get out that way. So in New York City, the most famous political machine that you have to know the name of is Boss Tweed, Tammany Hall. But as a local, you might be interested in this fella. So we're an urban area as well. And by the way, another famous political machine will be the Pendergast machine, which will be Kansas City. And Pendergast will actually own a concrete company, and he will do very similar things as Boss Tweed and rebuild a lot of the buildings in Kansas City that still stand today. But in Cincinnati, we will be led by a guy by the name of Boss Cox, and that's his picture to the right. Eerily, he looks like William Howard Taft, but actually those two do not like each other, so do not get them mixed up. And you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, William Howard Taft denounces Cox. They didn't like each other, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But anyhow, Boss Cox comes in, poor British immigrant. His father dies. He has to go to work at the age of 8. He is able to save money and purchases a bar on a very famous street corner called Dead Man's Corner. It's on the west side, and it was notorious for murders happening every evening, and they were never solved. It was never figured out what happened to these people. A lot of crime, kind of just a bad area. And Boss Cox ran a gambling ring in the back part of the bar, and he was always being raided by the police. And he kind of got sick of it. And he was like, well, you know what? To stop being raided by the police, what I'll do is I'll just run for office. And he ran for 2 terms in the city council. After that, he never ran for office again. He didn't need to, but he wielded an enormous amount of power in the late 1980s into the 1890s in Cincinnati. everyone that was voted into office, number one, was a Republican. And at the time that the police raids were happening in Dead Man's Corner, we were ruled by a Democrat governor, Democrat mayor, and that's why they believed that they raided his business so much, because he was a known Republican. So in the 1880s, he was a very powerful member of the Republican Party. And the famous quote was, "The people do the voting. I simply see that the right candidates are selected." And so very much like Boss Tweed, Boss Cox would put people in precincts and leadership in different neighborhoods and make sure that those people had jobs and that their projects were taken care of and there was a little graft coming their way. And when election time came around, Boss Cox would make sure that the right people were elected. He was synonymous for sending people from northern Kentucky into Cincinnati on election day and having them vote. The famous thing was vote early and vote often, and a lot of times people would vote in multiple places. Whatever he did, he found illegal ways to get his candidates elected. So his reign lasted for about 10 to 15 years. He went all the way into 1905, and in 1905 he got this idea to expand his territory in the suburbs, and the suburbs at the time would be like Norwood and Woodlawn and Avondale, some of those areas that today we would still think in urban areas, but they were the suburbs then. And people in the suburbs were middle class, and they really were unhappy with the way that Boss Cox managed funds. A lot of times with these political machine rings, you would have prostitution, gambling, a lot of alcohol abuse, and middle class people around this area were not very confident about Boss Cox and the way he managed things. So he eventually begins to lose a lot of his power when he makes that move. And in 1911, his candidate did not win the mayor's seat, and from that point on, he began to really, really lose a lot of support. If you're ever interested, if you go down to the Cincinnati Public Library and you decide to visit the branch that's in Clifton, they use Boss Cox's mansion. It's a really pretty building, but that is the actual public library in Clifton today. And so Boss Cox is going to be our version of Boss Tweed. And as a side note, him and William Howard Taft and the Taft family did not like each other. Boss Cox kind of ran in the circles of more lower class, a little bit more poverty. He kind of had connections with poor people in the neighborhood, and the Taft family was not. They were very upper class. The Adolphus Taft was a very successful lawyer, and so the Tafts did not like the Coxes very well, and they were especially resentful of the fact that he did these things illegally, and Taft did not want to be involved with him whatsoever. He was not a fan of his. Now, there's also a story about the reason why the Cincinnati Reds are here, and has to do with the Boss Cox, and that's also a little interesting read on that as well. Most of the Republican lenience today, we are a very Republican city due to Boss Cox. A lot of that stuff is left over from the turn of the century, and so we still remain a very Republican area in regard, thanks to him. Just a few things about negatives and positives of the political machine, because there's just like the Industrial Revolution, there's good and there's bad. Some of the negatives of political machine, there was rampant corruption. Clearly, when you're spending $45 million of taxpayer money, that's probably not a good thing. A lot of times these political machines were associated with prostitution, gambling, alcohol abuse. It's going to cost the taxpayers enormous amounts of money, but on the other side of that, it's going to give jobs for everyone. If I wanted a new sidewalk or I wanted some sort of government project, typically you could run it pretty efficiently. Just had to contact your precinct boss, make sure that you voted the correct way in the next election, and typically your project would get finished. It's also going to include a lot of kind of community involvement. These projects would unite different areas of the city and then unite the city. So a positive to that would be people got out of their house, they talked with each other. Even though there was a lot of criminal activity going on behind the scenes, crime was a little bit lower during the political machine because they make streets safer for neighbors, for families. And so that's one thing, that the crime was kind of hidden away, just like the Gilded Age would say. On the surface, this neighborhood looks great and nice, and a lot of good sewers are going in and roads are going in. But on the underside of it, that there's a lot of graft, corruption, embezzlement, and that's really and truly the way that the Gilded Age kind of gets its name. So, that is the Gilded Age, and I think I've covered all the notes. If you have any questions, always feel free to ask in class, and we'll see you later.